Ever feel like you're drowning in information about, well, everything,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to big issues like climate change?
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it? Trying to cut through all the noise and figure out what actually moves the needle, what actually makes a difference.
That's exactly what we're doing today. We're diving deep into how our everyday actions, the choices we make, actually affect climate change and greenhouse gas emissions.
And we've got a fantastic resource to guide us. A 2025 paper titled The Effective Impact of Behavioral Shifts in Energy, Transport, and Food by Kraftad, Hernandez, and Composto. It's like a roadmap to understanding which individual actions pack the biggest punch in this fight.
Our goal isn't to bury you in data. We're going for those aha moments, those nuggets of insight you can actually use.
Absolutely. We want to pinpoint those individual actions that can really make a dent in emissions, understand what actually motivates people to change their behavior, and honestly confront the gap between what's theoretically possible and what's happening on the ground.
So, first things first. Why does individual behavior even matter when we're talking about something as enormous and complex as climate change?
Well, the core idea, and the paper really emphasizes this, is that modern climate change is largely driven by human behavior, especially in three key areas: how we consume energy, our food choices, and how we get around. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, estimates that if we make comprehensive changes to those behaviors, both on a big systemic level and at the individual level, we could potentially reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 70% by 2050.
That's a huge potential impact. But we're focusing specifically on what individuals can do, right?
Exactly. The paper hones in on what they call the individual behavioral wedge. And the IPCC estimates that this individual wedge, focusing on the choices we make in our energy use, transportation, and food, could lead to something like a 34% reduction in emissions. It's a big chunk of the overall solution.
Now, the paper also acknowledges that not everyone contributes to this problem equally.
Right, that's crucial. We have to talk about fairness and responsibility. The reality is that globally, the wealthiest 10% of the population generate almost half of all greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, the poorest 50% contribute only about a tenth. So those who have a larger footprint, so to speak, have a bigger responsibility to make changes.
Makes sense. We also have to be mindful that what's feasible for someone in a high-income country might not be for someone in a developing nation.
Absolutely. So solutions need to work across different contexts, different economic realities. Now, one of the things that makes this paper so interesting is that it connects two different areas of research that don't always talk to each other.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
So on the one hand, you've got all these studies calculating the potential emissions reductions if people were to adopt certain behaviors. Like if everyone switched to a vegan diet, emissions would drop by X amount. But on the other hand, you've got all this research on what actually motivates people to change their behavior. What works, what doesn't in terms of nudges, interventions, policies.
So instead of just saying, hey, everyone, bike to work and we'll save the planet,
Yeah,
we need to also figure out how to actually get people on those bikes.
exactly. And that's what this paper does. It brings those two worlds together. They've come up with this concept of effective impact. It's their way of measuring what emissions reductions we can realistically expect from interventions aimed at changing individual behavior.
Okay, so they're looking at not just the theoretical what if, but the real world, what's actually happening.
Precisely. And to do that, they use a consistent system to categorize behaviors across both sets of research so they can directly compare, using the same yardstick, the theoretical potential of a behavior with how well we're actually doing at changing that behavior. And they've analyzed a huge amount of data, covering over 1.3 million individuals across various studies.
Wow, that's impressive. So what do they find? What behaviors really stand out as having the biggest impact on our emissions?
They identify 4 priority shifts. Think of these as the high leverage actions, the ones that really make a difference. First, drastically reducing our use of gas-powered cars.
Okay, less driving. What else?
Second, flying less. Third, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels in our homes. So things like switching to renewable energy, doing major energy efficiency upgrades, and finally, reducing our consumption of animal products, especially meat.
So those are the big ones. But what about those things we might already be doing with good intentions, but that maybe don't make as much of a difference as we think?
Right, they call those supplementary shifts. These are things that, while environmentally friendly, have a relatively small impact on emissions, like composting or making minor tweaks to our home energy use, swapping out light bulbs, that kind of thing.
So it's good to do those things, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that they're going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of just how different the impact can be between A priority shift and a supplementary shift.
Oh, the difference can be significant. The paper highlights that, for example, choosing to live car-free is a whopping 78 times more effective at reducing emissions than consistently composting.
78 times. That really puts things into perspective. So we have a clearer picture of what to focus on. Now, how effective are we at actually getting people to make these changes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The good news is that behavioral interventions do show a positive effect, but it's often modest. On average, these interventions increase the adoption of a desired behavior by about 10 percentage points compared to control groups.
10%. So it's a step in the right direction, but it suggests we need more than just a gentle nudge. What makes some interventions more successful than others?
The design is key. The paper found that approaches based on choice architecture, which is essentially subtly redesigning environments to make green choices easier and more intuitive, are very effective.
So making it easier to do the right thing.
Right. And then there are commitment devices, ways we can sort of lock ourselves into greener choices, like publicly stating a goal, pre-committing to an action, even telling our friends and family about our intentions to hold ourselves accountable.
Can you give us a real-world example of each of those?
Sure. For choice architecture, think about a workplace cafeteria. If the default lunch option is plant-based, with meat available but not as prominently displayed, people are more likely to go veggie. For a commitment device, imagine someone signing up for a car-sharing program with a mileage limit, or publicly committing to taking public transport a certain number of days a week, that kind of thing.
Interesting. What about things like providing people with more information, like carbon footprint calculators? Do those work?
The paper found that those information-based approaches, while well-intentioned, are actually among the least effective at changing behavior.
So just knowing the facts isn't enough to change our habits.
Right. It seems we need a bit more than that. And this leads to a critical point, a central finding in this paper. The difference between the emissions reductions we could achieve if everyone adopted these key behaviors and what we're actually achieving right now.
You mean there's a gap between the ideal and the reality?
A big one. Their calculations show that widespread adoption of these priority shifts could theoretically offset all average global per capita emissions. That's a potential reduction of about 7.2 tons of CO2 equivalent per person annually, compared to the current average of around 6.28 tons. On paper, it seems achievable.
But the real world is, well, messier.
Exactly. And here's the reality check. When they factored in the effectiveness of existing behavioral interventions, they found that we're only achieving about 10% of that theoretical potential.
10%. That's a sobering thought. It really underscores that individual action alone, without systemic change, is unlikely to get us where we need to be.
That's a key takeaway. Now let's delve into those priority shifts a bit more. Starting with transportation, what did the paper find about how we get around?
Okay, let's talk transport. What are the key actions there?
3 of the top 6 most impactful actions are all about reducing our use of gas-powered cars. This includes living completely car-free, switching to electric or hybrid vehicles, and opting for public transit, walking, or cycling more often.
What kind of impact can those choices have?
A big one. For instance, living car-free can reduce an individual's emissions by about 2.1 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. That's actually more than installing home solar panels and going vegan combined.
Wow, that's significant.
It is. And the paper also noted that while telecommuting and fuel-efficient driving habits are helpful, they don't have quite the same impact. Another important point, reducing air travel also has huge potential.
Got it. Less driving, fewer flights. Now let's talk about food. What are the key shifts there?
The big takeaway is that what we eat matters much more than how we manage our food waste. And reducing our consumption of animal protein, particularly meat, is where the biggest reductions come from. In fact, adopting a vegan diet is highlighted as the most impactful food-related behavior, potentially saving almost a ton of CO2 equivalent per year per person.
Why such a big impact from cutting out animal products?
It's mostly down to methane emissions from livestock, particularly cattle. And then there's the vast amount of land needed for animal agriculture, both for grazing and for growing feed. So yeah, composting and reducing food packaging are good, but shifting to a more plant-based diet is where the real impact lies.
Makes sense. Finally, let's talk about energy use in our homes. What are the priority shifts there?
Here, it's really important to distinguish between structural changes and more superficial changes. Structural changes, like installing solar panels or doing major renovations to improve insulation, have a much bigger and longer-lasting impact.
And what about those more superficial changes?
Things like buying more energy efficient appliances or just being more diligent about turning off lights. While those are good habits, they simply don't have the same impact as those structural changes. For example, installing solar panels can save around a ton of CO2 equivalent per year. That makes it the third most impactful behavior overall.
Okay, so think big picture when it comes to home energy. Change the system, not just your habits. Now, this paper draws on research from around the world. Did the authors notice any gaps or blind spots? It's a problem. We need a more global perspective on that. So we're better at studying how to encourage the easier, less impactful stuff. Yeah, I'm curious about that. Did certain types of interventions work better for certain behaviors? Interesting. So even though the overall potential emissions reductions from efficient appliances might be lower, our ability to actually nudge people in that direction is also limited. Yeah, I'm curious about that. Choice architecture, commitments, information. Do we know what works best?
Well,
So we're just scratching the surface, really.
hmm.
Now, based on all this research, what are the key recommendations for policymakers and businesses? How can they encourage these high-impact individual actions? And for home energy, food. How can we encourage those crucial dietary shifts? So nudge people towards those greener options. Instead of just relying on information campaigns. So we can vote with our wallets and our voices. So lots of opportunities for businesses to step up. If you want to make a real difference on climate change, what's the key message? So we need both. Those are the big levers. And it's worth remembering that how these choices are presented to us and the tools we use to encourage them can make a real difference in how likely we are to adopt them. So as you're reflecting on all of this, think about that gap between our potential to reduce emissions and where we are right now. What does that tell us about the kind of changes we need, both personally and as a society, to really address climate change? It is. And based on what we've discussed today, what's one priority shift that you might explore further in your own life? We encourage you to dig into some of the research yourself, see what resonates with you, and find your own path to making a difference. It is.